I won $81 million in the lottery and quit my job that same day. My boss laughed. "You'll regret this." But I just smiled and walked out. A month later, I bought his company. When he saw my name on his door, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always say that you never truly know someone until the power shifts between you. I learned that lesson the hard way. And then I learned it again in the best possible way. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 36 years old, and for 9 years I worked as Senior Operations Manager at Caldwell Enterprises, a mid-sized logistics and supply chain company headquartered in Chicago, Illinois. I was good at my job. Actually, I was better than good. I was exceptional, and I knew it, even if Richard Caldwell made it his personal mission to ensure I never felt that way. Before all of this happened, my life was steady in the way that a dull ache is steady. It didn't knock you down, but it was always there. I woke up at 6 every morning in my apartment in Lincoln Park, made coffee, took the Blue Line downtown, and arrived at the 24th floor of the Caldwell building by 8. I managed a team of 12 people. I restructured the company's distribution network twice in 4 years, saving the company an estimated $4 million in operational costs. I ran the numbers, I solved the problems, I stayed late, and I never once asked for the credit I deserved. Richard Caldwell took it instead. He was 53 years old, a man built on inherited confidence and a last name that had been above the company door since his father started it in 1987. He had silver hair he kept perfectly combed, a handshake he practiced like a performance, and an ability to walk into any room and take credit for whatever had just happened in it. He was charming to clients, dismissive to subordinates, and somewhere in between to people he hadn't yet decided whether he could use. He had decided he could use me. The first real warning sign came 3 years into my employment. I had spent 6 months developing a new vendor partnership framework, entirely on my own time, documented, presented, executed. The quarterly meeting where Richard presented it to the board was the first time I heard him use the word "we" to describe my work. I remember sitting at the end of that long glass table, watching board members nod at him, watching him accept their congratulations with a modest smile, and feeling something cold settle into my chest. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter, something that watches and waits. After the meeting, I approached him in the hallway. I said carefully that I was glad the presentation went well, and I just mentioned that it might be worth acknowledging the team's contribution in the follow-up email. He looked at me the way men like Richard look at women like me, briefly, assessingly. "Of course," he said, "I always credit the team." The email went out that afternoon. It said, "Thanks to the Caldwell leadership team for their continued innovation." I was not mentioned. My name did not appear. I told myself it was a politics game. I told myself I was learning. I told myself that competence is its own currency and that one day it would pay out. Over the next 6 years, it happened again and again. My restructuring plans presented as Richard's vision. My cost reduction models credited to the executive team. My ideas, my analysis, my late nights in the office, all absorbed into the story of Richard Caldwell's successful company. And every time I considered pushing back, I thought about my mortgage, my student loans, the health care plan that covered my mother's medication, and I swallowed it. But the most humiliating incident, the one that would define everything that followed, happened on a Tuesday. It was March 4th. I remember the date because it was the same day I bought my lottery ticket. I had been working on a client proposal for Meridian Freight, one of our largest potential contracts, a deal worth approximately $12 million annually. I had spent 3 weeks on it. Richard had glanced at it the day before, made 2 minor edits, and then presented it to the Meridian executives as his own work during a morning meeting I was not invited to attend. I found out from my assistant, Janelle, who heard it from the conference room coordinator. I sat at my desk for a long time after she told me. I looked out the window at the gray Chicago sky. I thought, how many more times will you let this happen, Sarah? That evening, I stopped at a convenience store on my way home. Powerball was at 81 million. I had never been a lottery player. I bought 1 ticket, almost as a joke, or maybe as a prayer, the kind you send up when you've run out of other options. 3 days later, I checked the numbers on my phone at 7:14 in the morning, still in bed. I checked them again. I sat up. I checked them a 3rd time. All 6 numbers matched. I put my phone down on my nightstand. I sat very still for approximately 4 minutes. Then I called my sister in Cincinnati and told her not to say a single word to anyone. Then I called a lottery attorney whose name I'd Googled before I'd even gotten out of bed, because some part of my brain had already started running calculations. $81 million, pre-tax, lump sum after taxes, approximately 54 million. Still a number that didn't feel real, still a number that could change every single thing. I took a shower, I got dressed, I did my hair, and then I went to work. I needed to see Richard's face when I told him. I walked into the office at 8:02 a.m., same as always. I said good morning to Janelle. I poured my coffee. I waited until the 9 a.m. team stand-up, where Richard always positioned himself at the head of the table to open the meeting with whatever motivational sentiment he'd read that morning. When he finished his opening remarks, I raised my hand. "Richard," I said, "I need to let you know that today is my last day. I'm resigning, effective immediately." The room went completely silent. Richard blinked. A smile started at the corner of his mouth, the kind that's shaped like amusement but made of something harder. "Sarah," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I think you might want to take a breath before you do something you can't undo." "I'm quite calm," I said. He laughed then. Not unkindly, but not kindly either. The laugh of a man who thinks he knows something you don't. "You'll regret this," he said. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about 6 years of proposals, frameworks, cost analyses, all with his name on them. I thought about the Meridian presentation. I thought about every nod and swallow and rationalization. I smiled. It was the calmest smile I had ever produced. "I don't think I will," I said, and I walked out. The elevator ride down from the 24th floor lasted 43 seconds. I know because I counted. It was the kind of thing you do when your hands are shaking and you don't want anyone to see. The lobby of the Caldwell building had marble floors and a revolving door that led out onto Michigan Avenue. I had walked through that door hundreds of times. That morning, stepping out into the sharp March air, I felt the strange, vertiginous sensation of a person who has just cut the only rope they were holding on to and is now falling, but falling, for the first time, into open space rather than into a cage. I walked 2 blocks north before I sat down on a bench near the Chicago River and let myself breathe. Was I afraid? Yes. Absolutely yes. And anyone who tells you fear disappears the moment you make a brave decision has either never made one or is lying. The fear was physical. A tightness across my sternum, a faint ringing in my left ear, a kind of mental static that kept interrupting itself with questions I wasn't ready to answer. What had I just done? I had a lottery win, yes. $54 million after taxes, in the hands of a trust that my attorney, David Park, was already structuring for maximum protection. But money, I was already beginning to understand, is not a plan. Money is a resource. A plan is something else entirely. I sat on that bench for 20 minutes, watching the river. It was brown and cold and moving in the way rivers move when they don't care about you, indifferently, continuously. I watched a boat pass underneath the bridge. I watched a man in a suit walk by, talking loudly into his phone. I watched a woman push a stroller with the focused determination of someone who knows exactly where she's going. I envied her that certainty. Then I went home and I did what I always do when I'm afraid. I opened a spreadsheet, not a metaphorical spreadsheet, an actual one. I opened my laptop on my kitchen table, poured a glass of water, and began to list the assets and liabilities of my situation with the same detachment I had once applied to Caldwell Enterprises' Q3 logistics review. The assets, $54 million, pending trust finalization, 9 years of intimate operational knowledge of Caldwell Enterprises, a professional network that included vendors, contractors, and former colleagues, and a clarity of purpose that was, if anything, getting sharper by the hour. The liabilities. I had no board experience, no public reputation as an executive, no existing business infrastructure, and an antagonist who currently controlled a company with approximately 47 employees, 3 major client contracts, and 22 years of established market relationships. I stared at the screen for a long time, and then, I don't know exactly when it happened, whether it was that evening or sometime in the middle of the night when I woke at 2 a.m. and lay in the dark thinking. The idea arrived. Not dramatically, not like a lightning bolt, more like the way a solution presents itself when you've been staring at a problem long enough, quietly, inevitably, as if it had been waiting for you to be ready. What if I bought the company? I sat up in bed. The idea was audacious enough to feel absurd, which is usually a sign it's worth examining. Caldwell Enterprises was a private company. Richard owned 70%, with the remaining shares split between 2 silent partners, brothers named Frank and Gerald Whitmore, who had invested in the company in its early years and had been largely passive since. The company had been profitable, but not dramatically so. Richard had taken on significant debt in 2019 to finance a facility expansion that had underperformed during the pandemic. He'd managed to stabilize, but his debt-to-equity ratio was a number I had personally reviewed, and it was not comfortable. He was, in other words, acquirable, if the price and the circumstances were right. I got up, went back to the kitchen table, opened the spreadsheet again. The question was not whether I could afford to make an offer. The question was whether I could structure an acquisition that Richard would be unable to refuse, either because the financial pressure made refusal impractical or because he didn't see it coming until it was already done. The second scenario appealed to me more. I spent the next 4 days doing something I had never done before. I researched myself out of an employee mindset and into an ownership one. I read acquisition case studies. I called David Park and told him I wanted to have a broader conversation about investment strategy. I reached out to a business broker I'd met at a logistics conference 2 years earlier, a quiet, careful woman named Patricia Holt, and I asked her what a company like Caldwell Enterprises might be valued at without naming the company. "Give me the financials," she said. "I'll tell you within a week." I gave her the numbers I already knew by heart. I also, during those 4 days, did a great deal of thinking about Richard Caldwell. Not out of anger, or not only out of anger, but because in any acquisition, understanding your target means understanding the person at its center. Richard's weaknesses were the same as his strengths. He was confident to the point of arrogance, which meant he would not easily recognize a threat from a direction he had already dismissed. He had laughed at me when I resigned. He had genuinely believed I would regret it. That laugh was going to cost him everything. But I had to be disciplined. I had to be patient. And above all, I had to be quiet. Because the moment Richard Caldwell knew what I was planning, he would fight it, loudly, aggressively, with every tool available to a man who had spent 20 years cultivating alliances. I needed to be invisible until I wasn't. At the end of those 4 days, Patricia Holt called me back. "Based on the financials you shared," she said, "the company is worth somewhere between 8 and 11 million, depending on EBITDA adjustments and how motivated the seller is." Motivated. That was the word I needed. "Patricia," I said, "I need you to find out exactly how motivated." She paused. "You're serious about this?" "I'm very serious," I said. There was another pause, and then she said something that I would think about for months afterward. "You know, Sarah, whoever this is about, people like that never see it coming from the person they underestimated. That's both the opportunity and the justice." I hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of my apartment. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago does in early spring. Gray and cold and indifferent, a city too busy to notice one woman at a kitchen table rewriting the entire future. Let's see who regrets what, I thought. The first thing David Park said when I told him my plan was, "Sarah, are you certain about this?" He asked it once. I told him yes. He nodded and never asked again. That's what I liked about David. He was a man of exactly one doubt per decision, and once that doubt was voiced and answered, he was entirely in your corner. His office was on the 18th floor of a building on Wacker Drive, all glass and clean lines, the kind of place that makes you feel that serious decisions are made there routinely and competently, which in his case, they were. We spent the better part of March and April constructing the framework for what would become, on paper, a private investment vehicle, a holding company I registered in Delaware under the name Northlight Capital LLC. The name was my suggestion. It felt right. Something that gives direction in the dark without calling attention to itself. Northlight's stated purpose was general business acquisition and investment. It had no obvious connection to Sarah Mitchell. David handled the documentation with the precision of someone building a wall one brick at a time, making sure no seam was visible. I funded it through the trust, layer by careful layer. Simultaneously, I brought in Marcus Webb, a forensic financial consultant whom David recommended, a quiet, methodical man in his late 40s who wore glasses with thin gold frames and spoke in complete sentences at all times, which I found deeply reassuring. Marcus's job was to conduct a shadow due diligence on Caldwell Enterprises, to build a complete financial picture of the company from public filings, industry reports, and the substantial operational knowledge I was able to provide from my 9 years on the inside. What Marcus found over the following 3 weeks was illuminating. Caldwell Enterprises' 2019 debt was more significant than even I had known. Richard had refinanced twice, and the most recent arrangement included a covenant that, if certain revenue benchmarks were missed by Q3 of the current year, would trigger an acceleration clause, meaning the remaining debt could be called early. Patricia Holt confirmed through her own quiet inquiries that the Meridian freight contract, the one Richard had stolen from me, had not yet been signed. The negotiations had stalled, which meant Richard was heading into Q3 without his most important anticipated revenue, with a debt covenant breathing down his neck, and with 2 silent partners who, Marcus discovered, had been making carefully worded inquiries through their own attorney about the possibility of a buyout. The Whitmore brothers wanted out. When Patricia told me that, I remember sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and feeling something very close to awe, not at my own cleverness, but at the simple, unglamorous mechanics of consequence. Richard had built an empire on credit and other people's work, and credit eventually comes due. But the plan required evidence, not just financial evidence. I also needed to understand the full scope of what Richard had done to me professionally, because at some point, if this acquisition became contentious, I needed to be prepared for him to attack my credibility. Men like Richard, when cornered, reach for whatever they can find, and the thing he would reach for was the narrative that I was a disgruntled former employee acting on emotion. I needed to arm myself against that story before he could tell it. I reached out to Janelle. Janelle Carter had been my assistant for 5 years. She was 28, sharp, loyal, and she had watched everything that happened in that office with the particular attentiveness of someone who knows they are invisible to the person in charge. I called her on a Saturday afternoon and asked if she would be willing to meet me for coffee. She met me at a cafe in Wicker Park. She arrived before I did, already holding a latte, and when I sat down across from her, she said, without preamble, "I was wondering when you'd call." "You knew I'd call?" "You didn't leave because of the lottery," she said. "I mean, obviously the lottery. But that's not what made your face look like that when you left." I looked at her. "Janelle, I want to ask you some questions about the Meridian presentation, about documentation, about what was kept on the shared drive and what was deleted." She was quiet for a moment. She turned her latte cup in a slow circle. "You know," she said carefully, "I make it a personal habit to keep copies of everything I touch in that office. Personal copies, on a personal drive, just for my own reference." My heart rate went up approximately 10 beats per minute. "Do those personal copies," I said equally carefully, "happen to include time-stamped drafts of the Meridian proposal, the original author metadata, version histories?" She looked at me steadily. "They might," she said. What Janelle had was better than I'd hoped. She had stored, on her personal external hard drive, the complete version history of the Meridian freight proposal, including the original document metadata, which showed my name as the author, my login credentials as the creator, and 37 separate edit versions over 3 weeks, all originating from my workstation. She also had emails, internal emails, forwarded to her personal account before she'd understood what they might mean, in which Richard had explicitly told his executive assistant to rework the presentation cover page, to remove my name and replace it with his before the Meridian meeting. It was, in David Park's words when I showed it to him the following Monday, a very clean paper trail. It was also, Marcus Webb noted with professional calm, the kind of documentation that, in the context of a hostile acquisition, could be introduced in board proceedings to establish a pattern of internal governance issues. And that was when things changed in another direction entirely, because around the same time that I was gathering evidence and building my case, Richard Caldwell began to notice that something was wrong. He didn't know what. He didn't know who. But I later learned from Janelle, who was still inside that building and who had become, through our coffee conversations, something between a source and an ally, that Richard had started asking questions. Who had been asking about the company's financials? Had anyone from a competing firm made contact with the Whitmore brothers? Were there rumors in the industry? There were no rumors. I had been very careful about that, but the fact that he was asking at all told me that some instinct, The animal instinct of a man who has spent decades protecting what he owns was beginning to twitch. He didn't know it was me. Not yet. But the clock, I thought, was already running. The first concrete move came in early May. David Park, on behalf of Northlight Capital LLC, made a formal approach to the Whitmore brothers' attorney with an offer to purchase their combined 30% stake in Caldwell Enterprises. The offer was fair, slightly above market value, structured with enough cash to make it immediately attractive and enough deferred compensation to give them a reason to cooperate smoothly with any subsequent process. Frank Whitmore, 67 years old and increasingly focused on retirement in Scottsdale, accepted within 4 days. Gerald, 64, took another week and a second call with his accountant, and then he accepted too. Just like that, Northlight Capital owned 30% of Caldwell Enterprises. Richard owned 70%. But a 30% minority stake, combined with the debt covenant situation and the carefully prepared documentation of internal governance failures, was enough to formally trigger the right to request an extraordinary shareholder meeting, which David filed on behalf of Northlight Capital on May 19th. The request was for a review of company leadership and operational governance. It arrived on Richard Caldwell's desk on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, he had found out who was behind Northlight Capital. I don't know exactly who told him. It may have been a paralegal, a filing clerk, a member of his legal team who pulled the Delaware registration and found a thread. In any case, my phone rang at 4:47 p.m. on Thursday, May 19th, and the name on the screen was one I hadn't seen since March 4th. Richard Caldwell. I let it ring twice. Then I answered. Sarah. His voice was flat. The charm was gone. The performance had been turned off, and underneath it was something colder and more authentic. What do you think you're doing? Good afternoon, Richard, I said. I was sitting in my living room. The afternoon light was coming in from the west. I had my coffee. I felt, to my own surprise, extremely calm. You bought the Whitmore stake. It wasn't a question. Northlight Capital made an acquisition, I said. Yes. Northlight Capital is you. Northlight Capital is a registered Delaware holding company, I said. But yes, I'm involved. There was a pause that lasted long enough that I could hear him breathing. You need to understand something, he said then, and his voice had dropped into a register I recognized, the one he used when he wanted someone to feel small. This company is mine. It was built by my family. Whatever you think you're doing, it won't work. I have lawyers who have been dealing with hostile acquisition attempts for 20 years, and I have relationships with people in this industry who can make your life extremely complicated. My lawyers have the version histories of the Meridian proposal, I said, including the email instructing your assistant to remove my name from the cover page. Silence. I'd be careful about threats, I added. They tend to become relevant in discovery. Another silence. Then, you're making an enormous mistake. You said that in March, I said, about my resignation. I don't believe I've made it yet. He hung up. I held the phone for a moment after the call ended, and then I noticed that my hand was shaking. Not with fear exactly, but with the adrenaline of a person who has just walked up to a very large dog and refused to run. The dog had not bitten, but it was not gone. 2 days later, a letter arrived from Caldwell Enterprises' legal team. It alleged that my acquisition of the Whitmore stake constituted a breach of a non-disclosure agreement I had signed during my employment. An agreement, they argued, that covered knowledge of the company's financial structure obtained in my professional capacity. I called David. He read it. He said, "This is speculative at best and frivolous at worst. Their NDA covers proprietary client information, not publicly derivative financial analysis. We'll respond formally. But even knowing it was speculative, the letter rattled something in me. Richard was not simply going to watch this happen. He had resources, legal and otherwise, and more importantly, he had the motivation of a man whose identity was entirely wrapped up in what he owned. Caldwell Enterprises wasn't just a business to Richard, it was his name, literally. His name was on the door. He would not let go without a fight. But he had also, I noted, retreated to legal letters rather than escalating directly. The formal channel was a form of delay, and delay was a form of fear. David filed our formal response on a Tuesday. The extraordinary shareholder meeting was set for June 14th, less than a month away. 3 days after the legal letter, a man I didn't recognize was parked in a car across the street from my building on 2 separate mornings, a gray sedan. I noticed it because of its stillness. Cars on my block moved. This one didn't. I photographed it both days and sent the images to David, who flagged it with the appropriate discretion and suggested I vary my routines modestly. I did. But I also felt, for the first time since this began, something approaching genuine fear. Not the productive kind, the cold, nauseating kind that whispers, "What if you've miscalculated? What if he has more tools than you thought?" I told myself, document everything. Proceed. Don't let him see the fear. On the last Friday of May, on the advice of almost no one except myself, I booked a 4-day trip to a small rental cottage on Lake Michigan, about 90 minutes north of the city. I left Saturday morning. I brought books, my notebook, and a bottle of wine. I told David where I was going and asked not to be called unless something was on fire. The cottage was small and cold and wonderful. The lake in late May is still gray and enormous and indifferent to human affairs. I walked along the shore every morning. I cooked simple things. I slept 8 hours a night for the first time in months. On the last evening, I sat on the porch and watched the sun go down over the water. I thought about my father, who had worked at the same factory for 31 years and retired with a handshake and a card. I thought about what he would have made of all of this. I thought he probably would have shaken his head and laughed and said, "Kid, you're either going to land this or it's going to land on you." "Yeah, Dad," I thought. "I know. But I was going to land it." I drove back to Chicago on Tuesday morning, rested, clear, and ready. The call came on a Wednesday, the first week of June. It wasn't from Richard. It came from a man named Gregory Ashton, a consultant, he said, specializing in corporate mediation. His voice was warm and professionally smooth, the voice of someone accustomed to entering other people's conflicts and being paid well to exit them. He said he was reaching out in an unofficial capacity on behalf of a client whose name he wasn't at liberty to share, to explore whether there might be a mutually beneficial path forward before things became public and, as he put it, unnecessarily messy for everyone involved. Unnamed client. I wrote it down on my notepad anyway. Richard Caldwell. Ashton's proposal was this. Northlight Capital would sell back the Whitmore stake at a premium, 15% above what I had paid, and I would sign an updated non-disparagement agreement covering all matters related to my employment and subsequent interactions with Caldwell Enterprises. In exchange, I would receive a personal settlement of $2 million to be paid within 30 days. $2 million to disappear. I remember holding the phone and looking out my window at the street below. A woman was walking a golden retriever. A kid on a bicycle was weaving between parked cars. The city was going about its business with its customary indifference to the specific drama of my life. $2 million is real money. Even for someone with 54 million, $2 million is not nothing. And more than the money, Ashton made sure to mention this carefully, as though in passing, it would mean an end to the legal exposure, the stress, the uncertainty. It would mean I could walk away clean, with capital and no enemies, and my entire new life ahead of me. It's a very generous offer, he said. I'm sure it is, I said. I'd encourage you to think about it carefully before responding, he said. These situations, when they proceed to formal proceedings, can become quite adversarial. Gregory, I said, I'd like to ask you something. Of course. Does the person who asked you to make this offer believe that $2 million is worth the price of my silence, or does he believe that I'll take it because I'm afraid? A pause. I don't think those are necessarily separate questions. They are to me, I said. Please tell your client no. I hung up, and then, because I am a human being and not a machine, I sat down on my couch and put my head in my hands and stayed there for approximately 8 minutes while something that felt like vertigo moved through me. Was I certain? Was I making a rational decision, or was I running on pride? $2 million, a clean exit, a fresh start with no litigation, no surveillance, no gray sedan parked across the street. No, I told myself. Think. The settlement would require silence, and silence would mean Richard Caldwell kept the company, kept the name, kept the ability to do the same thing to the next woman who worked 70-hour weeks and watched her work become his legacy. $2 million in exchange for allowing all of that to continue, that wasn't a deal. That was a purchase. He was trying to buy my conscience along with my departure. I uncovered my face. I sat up straight. No. The person who helped me most in those days was someone I hadn't expected to lean on. My sister, Karen, who lived in Cincinnati and had always been the quieter, more practical of the two of us. I drove to Cincinnati that weekend. We sat at her kitchen table with her husband Tom asleep on the couch in the next room and her daughter Maya doing homework upstairs. And I told Karen everything. The lottery, the plan, the offer, the gray sedan, all of it. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the most respectful things one person can do for another. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Do you remember, she said, what Dad used to say when we were small and we were scared of something? Fear means you care about the outcome, I said. Right. She refilled my coffee. He never said fear meant stop. She was right. I knew she was right. Not because it was comforting, but because it was accurate. The fear wasn't a signal to retreat. It was a signal that this mattered, that the outcome of the next few weeks would define something real and permanent about who I was and what I was capable of. I also, in that period, hired a personal security consultant on David's recommendation, a firm called Hartwell and Associates that handled executive protection for corporate clients. It was not dramatic. They evaluated my situation, confirmed that the surveillance had ceased, probably because Richard's legal team advised that it was creating liability, and established a set of simple protocols that made me feel considerably less exposed. And Patricia Holt, my business broker, became something more than a professional contact. She had followed the developing situation with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what it meant. Over dinner in early June, she told me, I've seen acquisitions like this go badly for the buyer when they lose their nerve at the finish line. Don't lose your nerve, Sarah. I looked at her across the table. I'm not going to, I said. And for the first time in weeks, I said it without any interior doubt at all. I did not expect Richard Caldwell to come to my apartment building. It was a Thursday evening, 9 days before the shareholder meeting. I came home from dinner with Patricia to find him standing in the lobby, not pacing, not agitated, but standing with the practiced stillness of a man who had decided to perform composure. He was wearing a dark coat, no tie, and an expression I had never seen on his face before. It took me a moment to name it. He looked humble, or rather, he looked like a man who had decided that humility was the correct costume for this particular occasion. "Sarah," he said, "I'd like to talk. Just talk. No lawyers, no intermediaries, just two people who have worked together for a long time." Every cell in my body said, "Don't go anywhere private with him." But I also knew that refusing to engage would be, strategically, a mistake. People who refuse to talk look afraid. People who agree to talk and hold their ground look strong. 5 minutes, I said, in the lobby. We sat in the small seating area near the mailboxes. The building's concierge, a young man named Dimitri, was at his desk 20 feet away. Good. Richard leaned forward in his chair with his elbows on his knees, a posture of sincerity, carefully calibrated. "Sarah," he said, "I think we've both handled this badly." "We." I noted the word. "I've been reflecting," he continued, "on how things happened, the way you left. And I'll admit this, there are ways in which you were not treated fairly in that company. Your contributions, the recognition." He paused. "I should have done better." I looked at him. I said nothing. "But this..." He gestured vaguely, indicating the entire legal and financial architecture I had spent 4 months building. "This isn't going to get you what you want, Sarah, and it's going to hurt a lot of people who had nothing to do with anything between us. My employees, 47 people who show up every morning and have families and mortgages. You know these people. You hired some of them." There it was, the real move. Not you, but them. "I know them," I said. "Then you understand what it means to destabilize the company they depend on." He met my eyes with an expression of appeal. "Whatever I did that was wrong, and I'm acknowledging that. Is this the right response? Is this proportionate?" He was good. I'll give him that. He was genuinely, technically good at this. At calibrating the appeal to the specific pressure points of the person across from him. He'd figured out, or guessed, that I wasn't doing this out of greed. And so he was not appealing to greed. He was appealing to responsibility, to my sense of care for people I actually did care about, which was, of course, exactly why I'd already thought about it long before he raised it. "Richard," I said, "I want to ask you something. When you presented the Meridian proposal in March, the one I wrote, did you think about how that affected me? Did you weigh my interests against your own and then decide?" He was quiet. "Or did you simply not think about me at all?" The humility shifted, not dramatically, just a small contraction around his eyes, a tightening at the jaw. "That's not the same situation," he said. "It's exactly the same situation," I said. "You're asking me to consider the impact of my decisions on other people. I'm asking whether you've ever done that with respect to me." The silence between us was different now. The performance was thinning. "I'm trying to offer you a way out of this that preserves your dignity," he said, and his voice had changed. Softer on the surface, harder underneath. "I'm not looking for a way out," I said. He looked at me for a long moment, and then, because he was who he was, because the costume never fit as well as he thought it did, he stopped performing. "You are making a mistake you will not recover from," he said quietly. "I have relationships in this industry that go back 20 years. If this goes badly, and it will go badly, you will not work in logistics again. You will not be taken seriously as a business owner. I will make sure of it." There was no warmth in his voice now, no appeal, just the cold truth of what lay behind the charm. I stood up. "Thank you for coming," I said. I walked to the elevator. I did not look back. I pressed the button. The doors closed. And in the elevator, alone, I let myself feel it. The full weight of what he'd just said. He had connections. He had 2 decades of relationships. He was not bluffing about his capacity to damage me in the industry. That was real. That was a real thing I could not dismiss or minimize. My hands were cold. But here's what I thought. Standing in that elevator, feeling the fear move through me like a current. He just told you the truth. He had dropped the mask. He had shown me what lived underneath the performance. And what lived underneath was a man who, when his position was threatened, reached for intimidation rather than merit. A man who had no argument on the substance, on the documentation, the financial evidence, the legitimate acquisition, and so he had fallen back on, "I will hurt you. I will use my power to hurt you." That was not the move of a man who was winning. That was the move of a man who was afraid. By the time the elevator reached my floor, the fear had not disappeared. But it had changed form. It had become something angular and useful, a reminder of what was at stake and why it mattered. Not just for me, for Janelle, for the next person who would sit in my office and watch their work become someone else's legacy. I unlocked my apartment, fed my cat, and called David Park. 9 days, I said. 9 days, he confirmed. "We're ready." "We are ready," he said. I hung up. I looked out the window at the Chicago skyline, the lights of the city spread out in all directions, indifferent and enormous, and full of people who had no idea that in 9 days, in a conference room on the 24th floor of a building on Michigan Avenue, something was about to end and something was about to begin. I'm ready, I thought, and I was. June 14th arrived looking exactly like any other day. The sky over Chicago was clear and blue, the sharp blue of early summer before the heat sets in. I woke at 5:30 without an alarm, made coffee, and sat in complete silence for 45 minutes. The strategy was done. I was simply letting myself be still before a day that would not be still. I arrived at the building at 8:45 a.m., a full hour early. David Park was waiting in the lobby with his associate Claire and Marcus Webb, who carried 3 bound copies of the financial due diligence, like something irreplaceable. Patricia Holt was there as a certified business valuator. Janelle was upstairs, present as a witness at personal professional risk, because she'd told me simply, "I'm tired of watching people get away with things." The conference room was the same one where Richard had presented my Meridian proposal 4 months ago. Same glass table, same view of Michigan Avenue. Surreal, walking into it from a different position, not as an employee at the end of the table, but as a shareholder representative with the documented right to be there. Richard was already seated with 3 people. Hargrove, his lead attorney, CFO Brian Strand, wearing the expression of a man awaiting news he has already calculated, and his executive assistant, face carefully blank. Richard looked at me when I walked in. I met his eyes. I sat down. David outlined the agenda: governance documentation review, financial presentation, and a formal vote on Northlight's acquisition of the remaining 70%. Hargrove immediately moved to adjourn. David produced the formal notice, delivered 18 days prior with signed confirmation. Hargrove looked at it. He sat back. Marcus laid out the debt covenant situation, the Q3 projections, the accelerated repayment risk, methodically, without emphasis. Brian Strand shifted in his seat. He knew all of this already. The difference was that now it was documented in front of someone with the standing to act on it. Then came the governance documentation, the Meridian proposal version history, the metadata showing my name as original author, the email instructing that my name be removed from the cover page. David framed it without dramatics. Evidence of management practices relevant to the company's legal exposure. Hargrove challenged the metadata. "It's falsifiable," he said. "Then you'll have the opportunity to argue that in arbitration," David said pleasantly. "Would you like to discuss Caldwell Enterprises' legal defense costs against the debt covenant timeline?" Hargrove looked at Richard. Richard looked at the table. Over the next 40 minutes, I watched a man who had spent 20 years winning by force of personality discover that personality was no longer sufficient. Every counterproposal, partial buyout, management agreement, delayed review, revealed in its very formation the desperation it was trying to conceal. Richard addressed me directly. "Sarah, what do you think this accomplishes? Genuinely." "A company that operates the way it should," I said, "where the people who do the work get the credit, where the 47 employees you mentioned have management that treats their contributions as real." "You think you can do that," he said, adjacent to a sneer. "I think I already have been doing it," I said, "for 9 years, without the title." Patricia's valuation confirmed the offer was fair, slightly above what the stake would fetch in the distressed sale that was otherwise coming. Richard sat with Hargrove for 11 minutes. Brian Strand stared at his hands. Then Richard looked up. Not angry, not performing. Just a man standing at the edge of the end of a thing. He nodded once. "Accepted," he said. The paperwork took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of signatures, wire transfers, regulatory filings, and dense legal choreography. The closing happened on July 6th in a conference room at David Park's office. Richard was represented by Hargrove. He did not attend in person. I noticed the empty chair where he might have sat, and I found that I felt, not triumph, something quieter, finality. I signed my name on the last page at 3:47 p.m. David Park set down his pen and said, "Congratulations, Ms. Mitchell." I held the pen for a moment. I thought about my father's factory, the blue line at 6 in the morning, 37 versions of the Meridian proposal, author S. Mitchell, 6 years of conference tables and swallowed words. "Thank you," I said. The Monday I walked into the building for the first time as its owner, I arrived at 8 a.m. The lobby had the same marble floors, the same revolving door. What was different was the 24th floor. Janelle was waiting in the hallway with 2 cups of coffee and an expression I had never seen on her face before. Open, unheld, unguarded. "There's something you should see," she said. She walked me down the hall. I nodded to employees as I passed, trying to communicate with that nod. "I know your names. I know your work. You are not invisible." At the end of the hall was the office that had been Richard's. On the frosted glass beside the door, where his name had been etched in block letters for 22 years, was a new nameplate. Clean, simple. Sarah Mitchell, Chief Executive Officer, Northlight Capital. I stood in front of it for a moment that felt longer than it was. I pushed open the door and walked in. The desk was the same. The view was the same. Michigan Avenue below, the lake on the eastern horizon, the grid of the city spreading outward. I sat down. I picked up a pen, held it, set it down, opened my laptop, and began the first day of work. At 11 o'clock, Richard Caldwell entered the building unannounced. The front desk called up. I said to send him up. He arrived on the 24th floor looking like a man paying an enormous cost he had decided could not be avoided. He walked down the hall. He stopped at the office door. He looked at the nameplate. He stood there looking at my name on the glass that had held his for 22 years. And then he looked up and saw me at his desk, watching him. We held each other's gaze for a long moment. I did not say, "I told you so." I didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said was already said in the documentation, in the vote, in the nameplate, in the chair I was sitting in. Richard Caldwell nodded once. Small, precise. The nod of a man acknowledging something he cannot change. Then he turned and walked back down the hall toward the elevator. I watched him go, and then I turned back to my work. The months after the acquisition were the busiest of my life and the most genuinely satisfying. The first thing I changed was attribution. Every proposal, every document now carried the name of its actual creator, not the team, the person. Janelle, promoted to operations director, helped design the system. At the all-hands meeting where I announced it, I watched 61 employees sit visibly straighter. I renegotiated the Meridian freight contract personally. 2 meetings, honest conversation, no performance. Signed by October. $12 million annually. Exactly what I had designed it for 2 years earlier at a desk with someone else's name above the door. By November, the company debt was cleared in full. I bought a house in Lincoln Square, south-facing windows, a garden I replanted with my own hands on 3 consecutive weekends. It was physical and uncomplicated, and I loved every minute of it. Richard relocated to Florida by spring. His consulting venture produced 1 press announcement and no follow-up. His LinkedIn went inactive. The gray sedan never came back. My sister Karen visited in September. We sat in the kitchen with wine and the windows open, and she looked around and said, "Dad would be making a completely inadequate joke right now." "Something about 40 lottery dollars," I said. We laughed for a long time. I was dismissed for 9 years. Then I bought the building. Never mistake someone's silence for surrender. Sometimes they're just building the door. What would you have done in my place? I genuinely like to know. Leave your thoughts below. And if this story stayed with you, you know what to do. Thank you for being here.